Hello and welcome back. You're watching World Talks and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. Slovak government of Prime Minister Robert Fico is having a difficult run-up leading to Christmas. People came out in droves onto the streets across the country to protest controversial decision to scrap the country's Whistleblower's Office. This is considered by the opposition as an attempt to weaken the rule of law in Slovakia, allowing corruption to fester among domestic institutions. The Constitutional Court of the Slovak Republic has temporarily suspended the law that was to abolish that Whistleblower's Protection Office. More about why the repercussions and what may follow the protests, potential European consequences for the country with my guest Grigorij Mesežnikov, president of the Slovak Institute for Public Affairs. Thank you, sir, for joining me here on the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Let's start from the very beginning. Let's understand why the protests are taking place.
Well, these protests are, I would say, the elements of the chain, which started a couple of months after new government headed by Prime Minister Fico was formed after early parliamentary elections in October 2023. And gradually these protests intensified. The main reason that time was just approach of the ruling coalition and the government to the governance. So authoritarian tendencies, amendment of laws which de facto disrupted the regime of rule of law, and very toxic proposals in the area of media and some foreign policy implications, especially these protests were intensified after first visit of Robert Fico, Prime Minister Fico, to Moscow, to Kremlin, and the meeting with Vladimir Putin. So this is a really long-term ongoing process with different intensity. In some cases, the turnout is very high. Let's say 1 month ago, when Slovakia commemorated the day of fight for freedom and democracy, it was anniversary of Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, November 17th. That time, really, the turnout was very high, extremely high. In Bratislava, 45 people came to the main street, this main square of freedom. On Tuesday and on Monday, we had now two different separate meetings. Only a couple of thousand of people came, but I think that regardless of the smaller turnout in the last series of such protests, still the tension is growing between the government and civil society and citizens, because this government is continuing to undermine the fundamentals of rule of law and the law which you mentioned. Law. De facto, it's really abolishment of very important institute of rule of law in Slovakia, encouraged opposition for protest, encouraged civil society, independent media criticizing government. So I think that the prospects for, I would say, peace coexistence of the government and the population, these prospects are today still more poor and poor.
So if it's getting poorer and poorer, do you think that there is a potential that these protests could lead to some changes within the government?
Well, from this point of view, I think that this protest probably will not directly lead to the change of the government, because this government is accustomed to operate in conditions of even tiny majority in the parliament. And now they have in the parliament relatively tiny majority, but all members of the ruling coalition, three parties, Smer party of Robert Fico, then Hlas party of the former leader was the current president Peter Pellegrini, and Slovak National Party, which is Radical National Party. I think that they are quite capable to keep the common will to operate even in such conditions. So theoretically, if some internal disruptions will occur, if the conflicts between ruling coalition parties will be more visible and more intense, then I think in such case probability of early elections, because the change of the government can be possible only as a result of elections. So far, I mean, Slovakia didn't experience such situations in which during the electoral cycle, the reshuffling of proportion of power between political parties led to creation of the new government. It's very unlikely. But what is more likely is that if the stability of ruling coalition will be undermined and they will lose majority in the parliament, which again is quite tiny still, then of course the probability of early elections will be higher, and then it can lead to the creation of the new government.
And from your perspective, what does this Constitutional Court's decision to suspend the law signal about the standards for example, abbreviated legislative procedures in Slovakia? I mean, could this set a precedent for what is going to happen to other potentially uncomfortable laws in the future?
Well, I have to emphasize that yesterday Constitutional Court releases two verdicts. The first was about this de facto abolished office of for protection of whistleblowers, but the second decision maybe was even more important, because concerning the first decision, it was just about stopping the validity of the law, temporary validity of the law, and Constitutional Court will be just deciding about whether this law is constitutional or not. But yesterday, Constitutional Court de facto cancelled the previously approved law about NGOs, about I would say foreign agents. It's aggregated unofficial name of this law. This law was approved a couple of months ago, and the inspiration for this law was the Russian law about foreign agents. So civil society resisted very strongly against this law, and I think that a couple of months ago it was the main reason for high turnout of the population on these protest rallies. Opposition applied to Constitutional Court, and opposition won. So these two decisions of Constitutional Court, of course, it's big encouragement for the civil society, for organized people, for citizens with democratic mood and democratic spirit, and of course for opposition parties. So yes, this decision was very important, and I wouldn't exclude that other laws which ruling coalition is now trying to approve, and I think that they have all potential to approve these very problematic proposals of legislation. Then opposition will apply again to Constitutional Court. And Constitutional Court, by the way, it's quite cautious institution. I have to say that there were some situations in which society, general audience, and of course political makers, opposition political makers expected that Constitutional Court will agree with the arguments of those who applied to Constitutional Court, but Constitutional Court decided in another way. So it means that if now the Constitutional Court is considering this legislation and is coming to a conclusion that this legislation is not in compliance with the Constitution, I think that really it's a signal that something very serious is happening in our country.
Which takes me to my next question, because as you mentioned, there is a lot happening in the country right now when it comes to legislative procedures and changes. Opposition MPs actually argued that planned transformation of that very whistleblower's office, and I suppose that applies to many other changes to the legislation that you just mentioned a moment ago, conflicts with EU law and weakens anti-corruption safeguards within the country. So what are some of the key legal risks, if you could point them out for us, that Slovakia could face potentially if court ultimately goes ahead with those changes?
Well, Slovak government was in quite sharp conflict with the institutions of European Union, with the European Parliament. European Parliament approved a resolution criticizing Slovakia's government for its approach to norms of rule of law. Then European Commission criticized Slovakia and then started the communication with Slovak government in case of some previously approved legal norms, for example, abolishment of special court or amendment of penal code, and then Slovak government, after approval of the first version, had to change again, to amend this legislation again. Now, unfortunately, and I think that it was very unfair toward the European Union, the ruling coalition was communicating the whole issue of approval of this law, which now is stopped in its validity, that allegedly the government consulted with European Union and agreed with the European Union about some common position concerning this issue, but it wasn't true. So I think that it's really it's indicating how the ruling coalition is more based on its own power considerations than on the issue of our compliance, Slovakia's legislation compliance with European norms and rules. And of course, there are some risks, concrete risks. First, of course, that European Union can start the procedure of infringement, and it will not be the first time since this government took over the power. And the second, of course, and this is the main, I think, headache for the government, because in such case, position of the government will be weaker and weaker if European Union will start to consider reduction of European money coming to Slovakia. I'm now summarizing. I mean, of course, there are different options, but it's very important to understand that 80% of all public investments in Slovakia are funded by European Union from Euro funds. So this risk, if this risk will be gradually fulfilling, I think that it will undermine position of the ruling coalition and the government, even among the voters of these political parties. This is really a very serious issue.
One more question just before we go. I would like us to take a step back to get a bigger perspective on what is happening in Europe. We have not only heard about the protests taking place in Slovakia, but we've also seen protests take place, for example, in Lithuania, in Hungary. As we're looking at these protests all together and this sort of a social unrest with the decisions of certain governments, do you think that we are facing a winter of discontent in this part of Europe when it comes to people's happiness about their government steps?
Well, we will see. I think that even if the reasons of these protests are different and very peculiar in all of these countries,
Indeed,
which you mentioned, I think that, of course, there is a common denominator, and it's approach of the ruling elites to the governance, to interaction with the population. And I think that, Slovakia case, despite the fact that it's really very nationally based case and it's about polarized society and the competition between national populist and liberal democratic forces, but nevertheless, I think that in all these cases, which you showed and you mentioned, I think that they are revealing that the ruling elites should be more sensitive to the demands of the population. And in this case, yes, we cannot exclude that maybe the next months will show us the intensification of these processes. Definitely in Slovakia, still the reasons exist. So the reasons were not removed, and the polarization of society is persisting. So at least in Slovakia, definitely we wait the really winter of resistance.
Thank you so much. Grigorij Mesežnikov, president of the Slovak Institute for Public Affairs, was my guest. Thank you for your commentary. It's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
And so this would be all for now here on World Talks. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska, and please join us here on TVP World for more news and features in just a moment.